Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Solana Larsen. I'm editor of Mozilla's Internet Health Report and your host for today's panel. We have a vital discussion planned for today. As part of our MozFest Dialogues and Debates series, we're going to unpack an issue that's underpinning so many of the problems online and offline today. That's data, and more specifically, who controls it and who gets to benefit from it. The data that powers AI and increasingly society is often controlled by a handful of internet giants. And their approach to data influences innovation throughout society, from the internet startup world to the public sector. And what we want to discuss today is what are the alternatives? We're going to ask, how could alternative forms of pooling and governing data become more common? And how can communities, be they technology consumers or workers, unlock data power? Joining me today are Dr. Funda Üstek-Špilda, researcher and project manager at Fairwork Foundation. She's based in the UK. She specializes in justice, fairness, and ethics issues with respect to labor and migration and gender, and studies visibilities and invisibilities of the gig economy. We're also joined by Astha Kapoor. She's co-founder of the Aapti Institute, a public research firm based in India that examines the intersection between technology and society. And Astha has over 10 years of experience examining the use of digital technology for development and social good. And at Aapti, she leads work on the Data Economy Lab, a space focused on data stewardship, in other words, unlocking the value of data while safeguarding rights. And then finally also here is Mozilla fellow Anouk Ruhaak, based in Berlin, like me. Anouk creates new models of data governance for the public good, and as an architect and advocate of data trusts, she promotes models that safeguard privacy and protect society from the negative externalities of data sharing. And as a final message, we're taking questions for this panel in real time. You can tweet them at Mozilla with the hashtag dialogues and debates, all written out in one. All right, let's get started. Data and how to govern data. I think that's something that easily becomes a little bit abstract and difficult to wrap your mind around. So we're going to start into this topic using an example that's familiar to many people, that of the gig economy. And Funda has prepared a couple of slides that she's going to introduce us to as conversation starters that will involve the whole panel. Over to you, Funda, and your slides.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in today. I will start our conversation with a bit of introduction to the Fairwork Foundation, where I work. And to get us started, the main issues that we're working on at the Fairwork Foundation related to data justice and governance in gig work, in particular, but also fair labor in general. If you can go to the next slide, please. The gig economy model is fairly established now. The Ubers, the Deliveroo's, the Just Eats or Zomato's of the world are really well known now, where the work is arranged on a platform and distributed on a platform, and where instead of the traditional employment structure, the work is either gigified, which means it's on a piece rate basis, or it is relatively sort of compartmentalized into short-term tasks, and it's mediated through a digital platform. So both the worker and the consumer, client, or user of that service signs into a platform, and everything is arranged through various bits of data. We put the arrangement of work on the gig economy into this table, where cloud work, which is work that happens online, from micro tasks such as Amazon Turk or online translation jobs, towards more geographically sticky jobs such as delivery or domestic work or care work or online beauty platforms and personal care services. And the amount of time spent on the job is also very has an important bearing on how the employment structure, traditional employment structure, is sort of, to use the word that is often being used, disrupted, from very disrupted to everything is broken down to very minute, very small task, where the worker does not have an understanding of the bigger picture at all, to having a control of the work entirely. If you can go to the next slide. The important thing to pay attention to, especially in the context of this webinar today, is perhaps the preconditions of the gig economy, which are very much data mediated. The technologies and the data infrastructures are the basic tenets of this newly emerging type of work. The ability to scale relatively quickly, both on the parts of the platforms, but also in terms of the globalization scale of the platforms, is very much related to the data harnessing power of the platforms, and how they use, how they collect, and how they work with the data that they collect. And perhaps one thing to mention is that data and the job flexibility also goes hand in hand, because with the main discourse in the gig economy being the flexibility of the jobs, that the workers can tune in and tune out whenever they need to or they would like to work, works sort of in tandem with the data discourse that they can decide to withhold or provide their data to these platforms easily, which, as confusing as the flexibility argument is, the data argument is also very ambiguous and vague in terms of when we think about whether the workers actually have those rights, have those capacities or capabilities to be able to give or withhold their data as they wish. So this is my general introduction to the gig economy and the data infrastructures that we're working with. In the next slide, I prepared some sort of fire starter topics for all the panelists and to discuss together. But if we have a bit of time at the end of the webinar, then I can talk a bit more about the Fairwork Foundation and how we're interested in not only studying, but also changing the gig economy and providing fair work to the workers in the gig economy across the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Funda. And so this is an example where we're talking about a company, a gig platform that collects data about the workers and controls the data and exerts power over the workers through their control of that data. And so in the case of, let's say, drivers, Uber drivers or some other taxi service, it could be controlling who has access to the gigs to actually be able to work. It could be about setting the prices at different times or in different places. It could be who is even shown labor or given the opportunity to work. It could be about pushing people off the platform, firing them, or asking them not to participate. Basically, there are all these different hidden functions of a gig platform that take place And, you know, the worker has the phone in their hand. They don't really know what mechanisms are at play. They don't really know the AI that's at work, nor have a complete picture of what kind of data is collected. So I would love to hear from Astha. This is the type of question that you also look at, not just from a labor rights perspective, but also from a perspective of, you know, if we have a model like this one, like the gig economy, or if we have a model like, I guess the one that most people will be familiar with are the large internet platforms or social media companies who collect lots of data and make money on it. What are some of the things that you have been researching and thinking about as an alternative path to this?
No, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Funda, for laying such excellent groundwork. I think that we've also been thinking about it in the same ways, and you can see that, you know, it's not just researchers like us, but also workers themselves, right? Increasingly in conversations and strikes there have been a ton of during the lockdown and, you know, in the pandemic during 2020, there's been a realization that there's a certain sense of control that's exercised over the lives of people, whether it's in the articulation of, you know, we want freedom from ratings, which was something that delivery workers in India were articulating during a strike recently, or we want greater transparency. There are workers in the Netherlands and in the UK that are actively seeking greater control over their data, and they're, you know, using GDPR's data portability to do that. There are unions that are getting involved. So there's a broader realization that data is a tool of exploitation and exertion of power over workers, and that we need to think about it differently, that it can't just be this relationship between the worker as a body that, you know, sort of is available for data to be extracted from, and that they have to have a greater say, greater ownership, greater control, greater agency, and, you know, there are over how their data is being collected, used, managed, what it's being used for, and in that context, we've been exploring models that allow workers on platforms to do that, and trying to see how those can be that those can be sort of expanded to be more widely accessible. So that's what we call data stewardship broadly, and there are nuances within it and lots of debate about what data stewardship is and is not. But for us, it is the ability to unlock the value of data. And of course, there's a lot of debate about what the value of data is, but to unlock the value of data for the community, for public purpose, and do so in a way that rights as defined by different regulations are protected, but also such that the data principals or data subjects have a say in how their data is being used and managed. And there are various instruments to do this. And to me, one of the most interesting ones that are beginning to take shape are data cooperatives that are, and, you know, again, in the labor movement, we've seen some of these. Driver seat is an example that keeps coming up, which is a data cooperative of drivers, which allows them to see, you know, what data is being generated by them in the course of their work. And the objective is to give drivers greater transparency into the data that is being generated on the platforms, and also give them a sense of, you know, like you were saying, Solana, like, you know, what kind of wages they're earning, how much time they're spending, when are they being tracked and when they're not being tracked. There's a lot of interesting interpretations, at least within drivers, in terms of, like, you know, if I play a game on my mobile, then I'm less likely to get rides, for instance. So everybody interprets the way they are controlled by data differently. So it gives drivers greater visibility into what data is being collected about them. And then also simultaneously, I guess, because sustainability of these models is a big question, it also, you know, monetizes this data, makes it available to municipalities, unlocks it for quote unquote public value, and distributes a chunk of the profits back to the drivers. So it's an interesting model to start thinking about it. It may not be perfect, it may not, it's just a starting point, but there are alternatives that empower gig economy workers to be bigger participants in their data lives, and sort of move move up the participation ladder, not just be as people that are sort of being exploited and manipulated, but actually being informed and actually over time having a seat at the table and being part of the sort of decision making.
Thank you, Astha. Yeah, this example that you mentioned is one that we chose to use as a spotlight topic for the Internet Health Report. How to unlock data power, using the example of drivers in this case, but also participants in the gig economy, as they call it, but people who use these gig platforms. It sounds really nice, like, oh, well, then the workers will have their data and then they'll be able to use it for lots of things. Again, it's like one of these things that at the theoretical level is interesting to talk about. But then when you talk to people who are trying to do this in practice, as we do in the health report, you realize that once you start building an app that is meant to collect data from lots of different people, who are using different platforms and different phones at different times, you run into all these different issues, not just technical issues of how do you get the data into which kind of spreadsheet, and how do you make that data behave in a way that's even useful for people to gain learnings from. Then you also run into a lot of legal problems and maybe privacy problems. And I know, Anouk, that's something that you're an expert on. And I'd love to hear, yes, your reactions to the panel conversation so far.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Yeah, when I was listening to all the great contributions, and it's been so interesting so far, I think that the thought that popped up for me is that it's really important to start with the question of power and real balancing power rather than with the question of data. And what I mean by that is the goal is not for workers to get data about themselves. The goal for workers is to have more power so they can stand up to the people that employ them. And I think we see this happen in a lot of conversations about data. It's basically the collection of data and the use of these various new technologies that, for instance, allow for jobs to be cut into smaller jobs and to kind of decontextualize work so that it becomes easier to swap out one gig worker for another, which obviously benefits the company way more than it does the gig worker. But those things exist and happened in a situation where there was already an enormous imbalance of power between corporations and workers. Like, that's not a new thing. That's a thing that predates the data, that predates these technologies. What these technologies allow companies to do is exploit more, to basically consolidate their power and extract more value from the workers as they go. And so the underlying question is not just how do we make sure that this part of the problem is solved and that we allow workers to gain access to their data so they can start to understand how these algorithms are managing them and how they are making decisions about them. But we need to also take a step back and ask, hey, do we even think it's a good idea for corporations to have this much power about their workers? And if not, do we want to maybe organize our economy in a different way? And there's some very obvious examples here of worker co-ops where workers share ownership of the company rather than the company controlling all the assets and the capital. But there are other examples and various other models as well. And the reason I bring this up is it also goes towards how easy it is to achieve the data goals. Because in a situation where the power dynamic is this out of balance, it actually becomes really hard to do the things that organizations like Worker Info Exchange, for instance, try to do. So what they try to do is fight on behalf of Uber workers to get their data from Uber so that they can understand how those algorithms are working against the workers, and then go to court to say, hey, this should never happen. Someone should never be accused of fraud based on some fuzzy data and some algorithm that made a weird decision one day. And that should never happen. And you can fight that in court. But Uber is super powerful. They don't want to give that data. And so you end up with long, prolonged court battles just to get the data out of Uber. Now, I'm not saying this isn't important. It's super important work and we need to be doing it. But we need to see this as part of a larger context and not as the ultimate goal of data stewardship. Yeah, I will leave it here. I can talk a lot more about this.
Funda, how central is data to the work that you're doing, and data rights, I should say, data and data rights to the work that you're doing at the Fairwork Foundation, which is so focused on helping organize resistance to labor abuse in the gig economy?
It is very central, and I'm going to follow up from where Anouk started the discussion, basically this unequal relationship between the platforms and the workers in terms of how data is collected and the say workers have in what kind of data it is being collected about them and how that data is then used for or against them. And one example I can give is, for instance, there are a couple of platforms that we have studied in the past year where this power imbalance was so obvious, and it's scaled up to such an extent that it would not be possible if the platforms did not have this data power. And the example I'm going to give is related to the worker protests last year that happened in India, especially in Bangalore, where a couple of platforms were able to determine which workers actually participated in the protests based on where they were logged in on the day, and then they were able to collectively either sort of lock them out from the platforms or take back their incentives or their accrued benefits on the platforms, regardless of the fact that whether or not they were in that location for protesting, or they were actually there for work, or they were happening to be just passing by that location. So this kind of power and control could not be imagined before, because of it is because of data that the platforms are able to harness this power. And it is for this reason it is central to our work as well, because it really ties into the fair conditions and fair management of the platforms and of the fair conditions for the workers on these platforms. And when we're talking about data, we're very critical about the consent, sort of the so-called consent that the workers have when they are signing up to these platforms to work on them. This consent is a very sort of unequal one, and it's a very sort of questionable one, because if a worker needs to sign up to a platform to get work, can he or she really question whether or not they're okay with their data being collected in that way? One other example I would like to give is that in some countries, for instance, the apps that are the worker facing apps for signing up to these platforms are actually not even on the official app stores. They are in sort of unofficial download sites where the workers need to go in and download the platform apps to sign up to the platforms and enter their data. These, because they are on unofficial sort of app stores, there are lots of issues related to security, privacy of data collection, and often it's very difficult for the workers, let alone other people who are sort of studying this, to understand the repercussions of using these unofficial data apps, because in terms of what is in terms of what is available for us to understand, there's very limited information. We can't really track what these apps do, what kind of data they collect once they're downloaded on the on workers' phones. So it's sort of there's some information that they can track. So for instance, if the workers are multiple, they're sort of using multiple apps for multiple platforms, sort of, they are re-apping with many platforms, so that then they can say, no, you're not an employee, or you're not really working on this platform, you're working for many platforms, so we're going to not necessarily give you these benefits. So in terms of this power structure, I think I will come back to the point Anouk mentioned. The power imbalance is perhaps the key to study in this sort of, to look at in this data relationship, and to understand how we can actually empower workers. Because data portability as an idea is a good one, but what will we then do with that data once, the platform gives it to us? And can we actually trust the platforms that they're going to give us the data that they actually have collected about us in its full form? Because even in the GDPR context, there are so many sort of subtext and small font details where the platforms can say that, yes, but that part of the data links to a confidential data of the platform, which we can't disclose. And unless there is a specific court case, can workers or unions or research organizations like ourselves, can we demand this data? And if we do, can we actually do anything with it? So, these questions are still very open-ended.
And I think for context, I should say, I mean, people might be watching and saying, well, I'm not a gig worker, or I don't drive for Uber, why should I care about these things? And I think the thing that I realized reading the work of the Fairwork Foundation, which is extremely global in nature and involves researchers all around the world, is that gig platforms are everywhere. There isn't any region in the world where this isn't huge. And so the types of practices that you may have learned of or heard of from Uber are also employed by companies that have origins all over the world. So it isn't just a Silicon Valley company thing, it's something that has spread. And it's not just about driving, as Funda explained in the beginning, it's in lots of different sectors. And this kind of behavior of using data for essentially the commodification of labor is something that extends not just to the gig economy, but to so many other parts of the economy. So you have other types of labor now beyond the gig economy that are also organized in this way. You have, now in COVID times, you have companies who are using many more surveillance and productivity tools to monitor workers, not just people who are working at home on their computers, but also warehouse workers. And I mean, basically this way of using data to organize labor is something that just seeps throughout society. In a similar way that we know that the way that the big internet platforms or the Amazons or the Googles of the world, the way that they deal with data influences how people think about their opportunities for making money online, or it's basically, it seeps into every aspect of our life right now, which is why it's so important that we start to think about alternatives and trying to think of ways where alternatives could also begin to seep into places beyond where they were first intended for. So these small examples that we've talked about, where the drivers are gathering their data in one specific part of the world, can we imagine futures where these kinds of things are adopted in other contexts as well? And Astha, I wonder, the work that you're doing is very much forward thinking in terms of trying to think about what the future could hold, and how you even think of, you call it data stewardship, new ways of governing data. Yeah. What do we do for this to become more of a thing that's known?
No, I mean, again, going back to what Anouk said, it is about power. And I think what the data economy broadly does is it individualizes and atomizes our experience in a very clear way. So and the workers are an example of how that happens, which is that, your shared spaces are lost, your shared experiences are seemingly lost, but they're not actually lost. And also, as Anouk mentioned, and, even the sort of cases that are happening where each worker is going and trying to sort of lay claim to their data against an Uber or an Ola or Grab at an individualized level. So I think that what ideas of stewardship or models of stewardship actually do, and they're very nascent and they're still developing, is help collectivize that experience and, helps workers or even groups of users collectively bargain on better data rights. And better data rights could mean, greater transparency, greater accountability. And these are all, sort of modes or mechanisms to rebalance power in a certain kind of way. And we're seeing this in all sorts of ways. So driver's seat is one example. There's a lot of work that's happening in the health sector, which is also, an area where people feel like data is being extracted, exploited. We don't necessarily know. And also, again, like in the context of gig economy workers, you're also at a complete disadvantage when you're interacting with your healthcare provider. You will give them whatever data they ask for because that's what's required of the moment. But how that data is being used, whether it's being used for issues that you care about, research that you care about, innovation that you may care about, all of that is stuff that is currently not something that data subjects or principals are a part of. So there's a lot of work that's also happening in the health sector on how to organize groups of patients, of people, of interested communities around questions of data so that they can actively participate in how their health data is being used. But all of this to say that, to me, stewardship and different forms of it, and data trusts, cooperatives, unions, are all ways in which you sort of break these isolated, atomized experiences of the gig economy and find ways to collectivize and build communities. And I know Facebook has sort of like taken the building communities idea away from us a little bit, but build communities of data that have shared experiences, that have shared interests, shared, and use those communities to bargain, to slowly reclaim power or try to rebalance power in the data economy. And that can look different things for different people, right? Like some people may want greater participation on decision making, and that's fine. Some people may just want a trusted intermediary to decide on their behalf, and that's also fine. But giving people the option and giving people the tools to engage in the data economy in a more equitable, in a more accessible, and in a manner that gives them greater agency is the idea behind data stewardship. And of course, I said, sort of unlock the value of data, but to think of value not just as monetary value, but value as user agency, value as governance, and transparency, value as accountability. I think those are all important. I think that when we think of value, we have a very narrow definition that has been defined for us by platforms at the moment. But I think that thinking of value as more distributed, as more democratic, is also the role of data stewards, and across disciplines, geographies, and uses, and they can have different uses in different and you could be as an individual part of different data stewards. You could be part of a data cooperative for your work, and you could be part of another instrument for another part of your life, and it should allow for that.
Anouk, I'm going to turn to you. I know you have lots to say on this topic, and we have also on Twitter a bit of there was a comment about a favorite topic of yours, I know, related to being paid for data. I mean, when we think about value, as Astha was talking about it, and we talk about data as a common good, does that somehow contradict data as an individual good or something that you individually own, or as a commercial good? Help us untangle this.
Oh, there's so much to say here. Let me choose my words wisely. So there is a lot of talk about oh, wait a minute, if companies are profiting off our data, then instead of companies profiting off our data, why don't we get a share of the profit? And there are situations where that seems to make sense. I think some examples like driver seats, for example, where they collect data on a whole group of drivers, then make an actual data set out of it that's useful for a third party. So they add value to the data, because data on its own, raw data, is not super valuable. So they actually create a product out of it. And then that product is, or the profits on that product are cooperatively owned. So that for me seems like one of the best or the better models of earning money for data. But to take one step back is really the question, like, what problem are we trying to solve here? Are we trying to solve the problem of companies are getting money and we are not getting any money? Or are we trying to solve a far more complicated problems of, like, first of all, this problem of the gig economy is giving drivers some data, some money for their data, going to really solve the problems that we've just laid out, which are far more complicated than, oh, here's 10 euros extra a month, right? Like, it's not going to fundamentally shift the imbalance in power that is in existence today. And that's true in a lot of other spaces as well. So for me, it's about that question, like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And I see, when I look at data stewardship, so I usually don't talk too much about should we get money for data or not. I kind of sidestep that question a little bit and ask rather like, okay, how can a data steward, how can data stewardship models help us either collectively get more bargaining power, or also us individually where that makes sense, because sometimes data really is individual, individually to make sense of the world and help us navigate this tricky landscape. And I see sort of like, yeah, I think we spend a lot of time figuring out the defensive approaches, but there's another whole other side to this story where rather than just saying, okay, let's make sure all those harms don't happen, like utopia is not just the absence of harm, it's also us collectively figure out what we want the world to look like. And it's not just what we want the data world to look like, it's what we want our lives to be. What do we want our societies to be? And so that question becomes about a lot more than who gets value about the data that's currently collected. It goes one step before that, asking what data should even be collected, but also how do I want to be seen in the world? What data is relevant for me rather than relevant to Uber? Because one of the questions that isn't solved right now is that you could ask Uber for your data, you could get your data from Uber, but that's how Uber sees you, right? That's the data that Uber filed was relevant for Uber. It's not necessarily the data that you think is relevant for you to make your life a better life, or for your community to make it better. And so we're seeing some really cool initiatives around the world where citizens are collecting data about themselves, because sensors are increasingly cheaper. So you can send people out into the world and collecting the data that they need for their lives. And that could look like local pollution levels measured within neighborhoods by local citizens themselves. That could look like people in community houses understanding how to live a better life within the context of that house. But then there's obviously a real risk that when people start collecting that data that they want to collect, that that can still be captured and exploited by companies. And so I think that's another way for data stewardship to be super important, to step in and to be like, okay, we collect this data, we have control from like the first step, from the collecting, from the designing of the experiments we want to do. But then we also find mechanisms to ensure that we keep control over the data and that we have agency to decide who gets to see what and under what conditions. So I know this was a whole long story, but it's really to say, like, just kind of collapsing this entire complex debate into should people get paid for their data or not, to me kind of misses the point. And just to add as a side note, so much of our data is not just about one person, it's about entire societies. And so much of the impact of data being collected in kind of a massive way is collective. It's felt by society at large. It impacts our democracies. And And so just saying, well, this individual should get some money for it, it's just not comparable to the problem we're trying to solve.
Thanks very much, Anouk. That was quite masterful to pack so much into such a brief comment. Funda, I know you have reaction to this, I'm sure, and I'm wondering also, as somebody who works with a specific community or population of workers, at what point do initiatives like the ones that we're talking about, that are trying to solve the types of problems that we're talking about, how do they become things that people themselves are genuinely in control of, and not just one where a company or an organization is saying something on behalf of them?
That's actually a very good question, and it's not an easy one to answer. As Anouk mentioned, the data metrics are still defined and controlled by the platforms. And that means that the value that is attributed to different bits of data is going to be still set by the platforms. So how do we sort of change that mindset? You know, how can workers and enter and intervene and say, no, this is actually not the whole story that matters. We can rewrite and re-narrate what is being told about us. And one way of doing this is perhaps looking at the time and how data about time, worker time on these platforms is being collected and what happens to that time. And this happens to especially, I mean, we've been talking about delivery and taxi rideshare workers, but especially in the cloud work context where the work happens online, we see this time and time again in micro task platforms and macro task platforms, where each task is sort of time measured, time stamped. But then workers' time waiting for jobs, and bidding for these jobs, or waiting until they get their payments. This is not necessarily taken into account by the platforms, even though they do spend time on this. So we have been carrying out a cloud work survey across the world, and with several hundred cloud work workers across the world. And our survey, for instance, shows that even though it changes really between a lot of between different platforms, still a significant chunk of workers' time is spent looking for jobs rather than on the jobs. So, for instance, one way of sort of, disrupting this thinking about how the data metrics are established by the platforms is perhaps workers to create another sort of data metric where the amount of time they spend on the platforms it also includes their time spent looking for jobs or in between jobs. And this applies to, again, both cloud work and also geographically tethered work. And this is something we've been trying to do at Fairwork as well. So our criteria for fair pay does include not only time spent doing the jobs, but also in between the jobs. So sort of, for a delivery worker, when they actually log into the platform, saying that they're ready to accept jobs until they log out, instead of just taking one sort of food package to somewhere, and that's the amount they spent on a particular ride. The kind of thinking is actually very simple here. When you go to a restaurant, you don't expect the waitress or a waiter in the restaurant to be paid only for the time they bring your food from the kitchen to your table. You expect that for the time that they are in the restaurant, they're paid for that. Whereas the gig economy is sort of, because it is compartmentalizing and breaking the tasks into so many individual and little time blocks, is trying to say that your work happens only when you're actually on the work rather than when you are at work in general. So what I'm trying to say is that the data metrics need to be challenged, whether it's the time spent at work or whether it's the location data that is collected about the workers, because there are so many examples and evidence basically that it shows that platforms collect data sort of non-stop, so that it is impossible to turn it off, that they continue running in the background as long as workers are logged into these platforms, or it's about their incentive levels, it's about how many different apps they've been working with, how long they've been on these platforms, and finally it's their right to be forgotten as well. Once they stop working these platforms, can they actually say, no, delete my data too, and I do not want my data to be collected, harnessed, or analyzed once I am off from these platforms. So basically, there is a lot of data information going out there, is out there, but what the workers can do with it and how they can understand how these data infrastructures are running behind, and what they can do about it is, I think it still requires a lot more sort of thinking through, and also a lot more information shared with the workers as well.
I think thank you. And several of the points you raise, I think also bring up like our short-term memory on these topics. Like we so quickly just take as a given that things are the way that they are with internet things. You know, it's only been a couple of years since the Ubers of the world arrived. It's only been, you know, not so long since the Facebooks of the world arrived, or the YouTubes, and we just get into this mindset of, oh, well, that's how it is, that's normal. And the companies invest a lot of effort into making us feel like that's normal and that's logical and that's the best way. And so when we're thinking about alternatives, or doing something in an entirely different way, I think, yeah, how do we have a conversation where we don't always talk about the bad things that the companies are doing, but begin to direct more focus and attention to, you know, thinking about things that we could solve. Astha, I know that Aapti Institute spends a lot of time thinking about this. Mozilla's own newly launched Data Futures Lab also spent a lot of time looking at your research and those of the handful of other organizations that are looking at this, because there really aren't a lot of groups thinking about this yet. It's an area where there seems to be a lot of promise. But when we looked around the world to see who is working on this, who's supporting this kind of work, it's still relatively quite few. So what do you think, how do we start to reframe these things? And maybe there are initiatives that you've seen lately that kind of inspire thinking in this direction.
No, so I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a very new conversation, and all of us who also claim to be working on it, I mean, it's only been a couple of years of thinking about it. So we're all learning, and that. So as Aapti, our role has been largely to learn from the landscape. You know, we first try to define what data stewardship is, and you know, everybody who's worked on it will know that it's a battlefield. Nobody agrees with each other on what it is. But ever since we've done that, we've actually started to think about like, what can we learn from people who are actually building this? You know, the real models in the wild. How do we learn from them? How do we harness that information, put it out in the public domain, so that, you know, there's a greater awareness about alternatives are possible. There is, you know, you can reimagine this, you can open up that conversation, and there are indeed pathways to do that. And here's how you think about the nitty-gritties of the decision making in terms of, you know, what model works, what kind of decision making, how much participation you should give people, etc., etc. So that's one part of what we're doing to sort of try to bring this to life. The other interesting avenue is the policy sort of landscape, of course. So, the Indian non-personal data committee report, which is a cause of a lot of, or site for a lot of discussion, and there's much that is, unclear and wrong with it, but does mention community data rights. So it's one of the first sort of policy documents to actually come out and say that. And interestingly, also has a very complex role set out for a quote unquote data trustee that helps communities realize these rights and helps draw again the language of value from their data, but also to mitigate harm. So it's interesting that even as the sort of research community and the actual sort of builders of data stewardship models are sort of tinkering about, there is a recognition on the policy level as well. And of course, the question of data is being approached from many different directions. We are talking about it from a rights-based perspective, but there's obviously a huge amount of interest in data value and sharing from the antitrust and competition perspective. There's a huge amount of interest from the data sovereignty perspective. So there is, there are different ways of approaching the data question, the way in which individuals and communities can have greater agency over their data, but it's obviously happening at different levels. But again, it's a very new conversation. We've been saying this, I know Anouk has been saying this, but we need to test more of these models. And I think that the more we build, the more we do, the more we learn, and we can actually experiment, because data is not a simple thing. Worker data is very different from CCTV data that is collected in malls or wherever. So there are different data types, there are different concerns, there's different kinds of values, questions around it, and that needs nuances in the way that we think about sort of user-led, user-enabled governance of it. So I think that, this is not much of a where do we go from here answer, unfortunately, Solana, but I think that the idea is to do more research, to do more thinking, and also to constantly be aware of the policy developments, because invariably sometimes, and particularly when there are so many interests at play, the policy conversation should not get ahead with what evidence we have from the ground. So I think that all of us in the community are now sort of busying ourselves to try to create evidence, and also to see how these ideas can be instantiated in existing institutions. So for me, I think data, or rather the structure of cooperatives, is a really, really ripe sort of site for embedding some thinking around data, because they're organized groups of people that have shared experiences on certain parts of their lives. And can you help cooperatives start thinking about data? I know that there's a lot of work happening out of Europe on data unions as well, or rather helping unions think about data more critically. So how do we also leverage existing institutions to start having more conversations about data rights?
Right. And that is a challenge of it, isn't it? Because the data rights and the legal situation differs entirely from place to place, both on things like cooperatives and unions and trusts, which are encoded in law in different parts of the world, but other parts not, and not known. Anouk, I think you might end up having the last word. As Astha was talking, I was wondering, you've been involved in a number of different experiments on data trusts and different ways of using data. When you've been involved in experiments, have there been ways that your mind was shifted, or where you learned something really significant in a new direction? Thinking how innovation and investments in innovations might be, what can we even expect to learn from them? How does it change our perspective on things?
Yeah, there's so many learnings. So I've been in the data world for quite a few years now. And yeah, I think I started out with thinking about the kind of the collective nature of data collection and the collective impact of that data. And I feel like my learning is going kind of circular. And what I mean by that is that there are moments and periods where I'm intensely focused on the data of it all, on the questions of what can you do with data, how does machine learning work, what is the legal side of this, like what are the legal rights. I'm not a lawyer, so that was a steep learning curve. But what it keeps coming back to for me is that we will never win this war, and we will never imagine a better world for ourselves when it comes to data if we fixate on the data. We need to tie it to real world problems. We need to tie it to real world imaginations for the future, because on its own, it's not really a thing. And so what I mean by that is, yes, let's look at worker data, but let's look at the underlying conditions of work. Or to reframe it in a very popular phrase, which is surveillance capitalism. Let's not completely fixate on the surveillance, but also look at the underlying capitalism. And then to your earlier question, Solana, yeah, it's hard to imagine alternatives. Like we get very, it's so easy for us to take the world for granted and not ask ourselves, hey, what does a different world look like? And also then allow for many different answers to that question, and to allow for a world in which those different answers can coexist. Those are really hard things, but in order to get there, we need to at least start asking, like, hey, what do we actually want to, what is the world we want to live in? What is the world we want to leave behind to our children? So yeah, for me, what I come back to is this kind of rebalancing between defending against the worst harms, making sure that when things like the gig economy happen, and I'm almost like data stewardship can help there, but also we should be able to rely on our governments to say like, hey, this should never happen. Something should just never happen. And we can discuss long and hard about data stewardship models, but maybe we just bend those things all together. So that's kind of the make sure that we don't burn the world where we're trying to make a better one. But then at the same time, imagine and then try to figure out what are the first steps to building those imaginations and learning from those steps. And to bring it all back to data, I think data stewardship has a role to play here, by, for one, ensuring that people have the information, and that information is symmetry that we're currently experiencing, where companies have all the insights and we have very little insights, that gets solved somewhat. So we actually have some agency to start imagining these things. But at the same time, as we start using new technologies for ourselves and in a way that we want, that we protect the initial intentions of those endeavors. So that, let's say, when I start an organization working for like trying to allow different groups to communicate to each other, and I tell those groups, look, I'm never going to be evil with your data, I share your values, that 5 years from now, someone cannot just buy my company and completely change the course, right? Like we can build in those protective mechanisms, and data stewardship can help us with that. So once again, a whole long monologue, but I hope that gives us some idea of what to do next. Also, I would say if you were looking for more concrete ideas, head over to the Data Futures Lab site on the Mozilla site, because we've got some actual projects that are working on these things in the real world in a very concrete way.
Thank you so much, Anouk. Thank you so much to all three speakers. Definitely follow that work, Mozilla Data Futures Lab, Internet Health Report, Fairwork Foundation, Aapti Institute. Keep in touch with the speakers here and with each other on this important topic. There's so much to iron out, and it's so important for people from all walks of life to be talking about this and considering what we can do. Data matters to creating a better world. Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope you all enjoy MozFest. This was Solana, and I'll just say goodbye now. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Solana.